Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, there were men that were dancing, creeping, and crooked, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? What's a tantalus? Or a gasogene? And what's the difference between a hansom cab and a four-wheeler?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 351, The Ripper and the Crown. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And are you rippered from the headlines, Bert?
Completely rippered from the headlines. Yes, exactly right. Torn to shreds.
We are going to have a rip-roaring time this time, that is for sure. This is one of those master's class episodes where we take a piece of classic Sherlockian scholarship, something that was masterfully done, and we walk through it and kind of give our assessment and admiration and talk about anything that happens in between. And in this case, we are still working with the late, great Michael Harrison, Sherlockian and Holmesian extraordinaire. Someone who pumped out a lot of Sherlockian scholarship in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And this piece comes from the World of Sherlock Holmes, which I'm going to check my... I've got the British edition. It was published in 1973. So should be an interesting analysis here. The show notes are available at ihose.co/trifles351, all lowercase, ihose.co/trifles351. That'll take you to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com website, where you can look through any links that we have. You know, if I have a link to getting a copy of this particular book, it'll be there. We, of course, do have a link to our Patreon page, patreon.com/trifles. Our patrons, for as little as $1 a month, get these shows ad-free, and they get bonus content from time to time, sometimes going behind the scenes with us to hear other conversations or outtakes or anything that we happen to come across that we think is worthy for our community of supporters. So thank you for that. And I should also note we had a newfound listener who's got all caught up on the episodes, ask us about the Discord channel that we had one time promised. And I'm sorry to say that was kind of a flash in the pan because there was slow pickup at first, and quite frankly, it's a lot to manage. It's just one more thing for us to keep our fingers on, and, well, we're kind of busy people otherwise. So we do have a community of sorts in the Patreon platform. So we will do polls and start discussions and things there to kind of answer for that need that Discord just doesn't fill. Okay, well, we said that we are definitely going to talk about Michael Harrison and the Ripper and the Crown. Now, there's only one Ripper I can think of, Bert. Is it Fred the Ripper? No?
Well, I thought it was Ralph the Ripper.
That's what we call my uncle at Thanksgiving.
Oh, dear. No, this is Jack the Ripper, a subject that's occupied the time and attention of so many people, so many Sherlockians and others over the years. Michael Harrison, whom we've discussed before, so I'll point you to our prior episodes about Michael. Born 1907, real name Morris Desmond Rohan, written, as you say, quite a bit about Sherlock Holmes and many other things. Wrote a book called The Roots of Witchcraft. Fascinating guy. Michael, who died, sadly, 33 years ago in September 13, 1991. Yeah, 32 years ago. Among other things, was quite interested, fascinated by, did a great deal of research around, and wrote about Jack the Ripper. And in this story, The Ripper and the Crown, this essay, he begins, conveniently enough, by reminding you of that. He says, I wrote a book called Clarence, the first full biography of the Duke of Clarence and Avondale, the eldest son of the Prince of Wales, who was later King Edward VII, and I have refuted the rumor that the Duke was the homicidal maniac known to history as Jack the Ripper. And I have named the Duke's tutor, the brilliant but insane James Kenneth Stephen, as the Ripper. So he reminds you that he's done all this and now gets to the point, which is an extraordinary essay which delves into and will end with a rather surprising connection between Sherlock Holmes and Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, it's really a nicely done essay. And as you'll hear as we go through it, he does provide a lot of detail, as you would expect someone who has just come off writing a biography about the Duke of Clarence would have. But there is a portion of this, with spoiler alert, where it reads like a gossip rag. And part of this is necessary because let's think about Ripperology for a moment. Almost as fervent, or maybe more fervent than the Sherlockian movement in some circles, Ripperology is a thing. And you and I, Bert, know many Sherlockians who are also Jack the Ripper fanatics, or whatever they call themselves. They are Ripperologists. And there has been so much effort that has been put into identifying Jack the Ripper. It's akin to finding the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot in some circles, although we know that the killings actually happen. And interestingly enough, as Michael Harrison says, the Duke of Clarence was named as one of them. This has always been a controversial one because a member of the royal family being accused of committing these crimes seems a little extreme. But before we get into who J.K. Stephen was, or it's J.K. Stephen. I'm getting mixed up already. I'm jumping ahead of myself with Bert Stevens. Let's talk a little bit about who Clarence, the Duke of Clarence, was.
Okay, why don't you do that?
So he was. Thanks. He was also.
I think he was the eldest son of the Prince of Wales. Wasn't
That's
he?
right.
Yes.
He was known as Prince Eddie, yes. And he was the eldest son of the Prince of Wales. So the heir apparent. After the death of Queen Victoria and the death of Edward VIII, he would have been, Edward VII, he would have been next in line for the throne. Of course, he actually predeceased both his father and his grandmother, so there was never that promise that was that close to happening. But that's who we're talking about here, the eldest son of Edward VII. And he was born prematurely and had some health issues, and there were rumors that he may have been mentally incapacitated or mentally compromised in some way, which is part of, I guess, in polite society of the Victorian times, this would be why he was considered someone who was off of his rocker and able to commit those crimes.
Well, as Michael said, that's a very good introduction. And Michael has reminded us at the beginning of this that he has already named the Duke of Clarence and Avondale, Eddie. He's already named the Duke's tutor, the brilliant but insane James Kenneth Stephen, as the Ripper. And he makes this connection. He starts sort of almost immediately getting us to the world of Sherlock Holmes. He says, public opinion was inclined to attribute murders to the killer known as the Ripper as early as 1887. And there is a small piece of evidence, not only that a Ripper murder had been committed before the end of 1887, but that Holmes knew of it. And there's no more record in the Holmes-Watson file than the brief mention in The Adventure of the Norwood Builder of the case of Bert Stephens, the terrible murderer.
Now, this is interesting because James Kenneth Stephen, Stephen, was the tutor of the Duke of Clarence. And Bert Stephens, Stevens, is the named killer in the Norwood Builder. So, again, one of these sleights of hand that Watson was so good at. And of course, as you're going to hear in the timeline, the Norwood Builder, I believe, took place in 1895. It was part of the return of Sherlock Holmes, so it was published later. So this would have been after James Kenneth Stevens passed away. So Watson, in his discretion, knew that he had already passed on, so felt safe in creating this alias that was so close to his name.
Well, and now we can get on our skates for a couple of minutes and sort of zip through some of this. Michael tells us about James Stephen and how he may have become deranged or affected in some ways. There was evidence of an accident which is supposed to have taken place when James Stephen was a young man, struck by the open door of a passing train, struck by the vane of a revolving windmill, and so on. And he says, it could be that there was no accident as such, and that this fellow simply manifested a little earlier than was customary in the family, the syndromes of a hereditary mental complaint. But he says, of course, the issue here is that Stephen had been chosen by the Prince and Princess of Wales on the recommendation of Dr. Dalton, tutor promoted governor of Prince Eddie and Prince George of Wales, to tutor Eddie through his 2 years as an undergraduate of Trinity College, Cambridge. So here's the Duke of Clarence and Avondale being tutored by this mad or theoretically deranged James Stephen, or not theoretically deranged. And then Michael takes us to, he asks the question, well, if the British royal family had been regarded as respectively bourgeois, I suppose it could have stood the revelation that an heir to its throne had a maniac, even a homicidal maniac, for a tutor. But there had been too many scandals. And now Michael sort of opens the file cabinet of his memory and tells you all about those scandals in some detail. He says, well, the scandal-giving royal dukes in Victoria's reign, were enormous, with the exception only of the Duke of Connaught and Strathern. All of Queen Victoria's sons were a wild lot who had almost every vice in common with those which had made the Georgian royal dukes a scandal. Yeah,
and I like how he says that the one thing which may be said of them in their favor is that their vices were all normal, quote unquote normal. Women, drink, gambling, driving railway trains, horseplay on the streets, and unkind practical joking. Why? They might be one of us.
That's right. Now, wait a minute. What about, do you notice in that sentence he's got driving railway trains?
Well, sure. Who hasn't driven a railway train, Bert? Come on.
They chased the respectable women, especially the wives of their respectable friends. They kept all the most notorious women of ill repute, from Cora Pearl to Lily Langtry, patronized the most sinister elements of the turf, borrowed money, repaid loans by introductions to royalty, made the lenders members of their clubs, gave them lesser titles, invited them to their homes. And then he goes into all of the suggestions of sexually transmitted disease, of the Prince of Wales' appearance in law courts. Tells us about the Duke of Teck, the son of a morganic marriage of the Duke Alexander of Württemberg, the father of this particular princess and that princess, who enjoyed a dubious reputation. He raced, went into bars. He was a hail fellow, well met with every shabby tipster and tout, every professional punter and tic-tac man, a world of friendships which seemed to accord oddly with even the vaguely military background that he affected. Oh dear, oh dear. It reminds me, of Watson's early comment about Holmes, that he seemed to know the details of every horror that had been committed. Michael seems to know the details of every royal-related scandal committed over decades.
Yeah, a real Langdale Pike he was. A historic Langdale Pike. Yeah, it's astounding when you think about it. And perhaps this is the genius of the longevity of the British royal family. Is until recent years they've been able to keep much of this stuff under their hats, or relatively speaking, under their hats. I mean, it was still known back in the Victorian times, but what a singular, I suppose it isn't singular. It's a repeated version of the family trait repeating itself generation after generation, and the Queen or whomever from the royal household is in charge having to play cleanup to keep this stuff out of the press.
Well, too, and in those days, of course, when Days Michael's talking about, the press was much more controlled and manageable than it is today. But the interesting thing is that Michael, throughout all of this, speaks of these people as contemporaries. It's not as we would be thinking about people from the 1920s or the 30s and 40s, people who are just names. He really seems to speak of them as contemporaries. But anyway, we're sort of on the road here to Sherlock Holmes. He tells us, of course, that James Stephen, the tutor, on the 21st of November, 1891, entered a lunatic asylum at Northampton, from which he was never to emerge alive. And then he says, since I finished my book about Clarence, I found so many interesting things that have to do with the identity of the Ripper. So since I wrote that book, he says, I found out. And where I found out is very interesting. I found out, he says, in the first volume of Professor Quentin Bell's Life of Virginia Woolf, who was J.K. Stephen's first cousin, that Stephen habitually carried a sword stick. That is to say, Stephen went around London and Cambridge, where he was a fellow, constantly armed. And Professor Bell relates how, upon one occasion, he ran into the Stephen's cousin, J.K. Stephen ran into the Stephen cousin's house at 22 Hyde Park Gate, drew the sword from his stick, and thrust it into a cottage loaf.
Well, that's a strange way of asking for some bread. Yeah, that is definitely not your average behavior.
Yeah, but so here you have someone who's suspected of being Jack the Ripper is walking around London armed with a sword stick. Well, I think that is kind of interesting. Yeah,
it is, and I think the stretch is how you go from attacking inanimate bread to actual women. But again, in this strange world of the royals and the royal household, it probably isn't that far-fetched.
Yeah, probably not.
Well,
now,
why don't we take
let's
a quick break here?
Good
and when we
idea.
come back, we will continue with this unsavory and ludicrous connection between Jack the Ripper, the Duke of Clarence, J.K. Stephen, and Sherlock Holmes. When you're looking for reference material regarding the Sherlock Holmes stories, the Baker Street Journal has been providing thoughtful articles since 1946. The topics range from the trifling to deep conundrums, but they all center around Sherlockian scholarship. And maybe you've been subscribing for years, or maybe you have yet to subscribe. But there's one resource that can make your research easier to do: the EBSJ. The EBSJ is an electronic copy of all the back issues of the Baker Street Journal from its inception in 1946 through 2011 in PDF format. That's 276 issues with more than 18,000 pages, spanning the old series to the new series, the Christmas annuals, all the way through 2011. It's entirely searchable, so you can find what you need in just seconds. Check out the EBSJ on BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. Okay, we're back, fellow Ripperologists. We were just extracting the sword stick from the cottage loaf. And where does that put us?
Well, it puts us to, one of Michael's first observations about Holmes. He says, and he's gone through more scandals about Stephen that we're not mentioning here, and says, the hand of Holmes in all of this is apparent nowhere. But some excuse may be found for the muddle and the muddlers, in that there were several law-enforcing bodies at work, all stumbling over each other's feet. So he says, Holmes could not have been involved up to this point because this is just such a mess. And he talks about some of the people who were involved in the Foreign Office and others, and some of the work that the government initiated, by which justice seems to have been done only so that the names of various royals could be kept out of publicity. But and then takes us to a very interesting connection back to Watson. And he refers to the case of, he refers to Silver Blaze, which occurred in 1890, and the subconscious rendering on Watson's behalf of isonomy as somony. And so he thinks that, that use of that unnatural word may be explained only if at the time of writing Watson had an unnatural vice on his mind. So here's another sort of vague echo of connections to J.K. Stevens.
Yeah, I thought this was a bit of a stretch from Harrison's perspective. Isonomy to somomy. And he implied that maybe I can't find it at the moment. I think he said it outright, but I'm remembering the implication that he said sodomy was involved in some of these relationships. So the slip of the pen from isonomy to somomy. Although it could be that they didn't want to give all of themselves. It wasn't all of me, it was just some of me.
Some of me. Well, and he refers to the Cleveland Street scandal.
There it is, yeah.
Which is related to that several years before. Anyway, now we're sort of, it really is just a magnificent thing, and it's a delight to read. I know we're skimming over some of these things. So, James Kenneth Stephen died in St. Andrew's Hospital, Northampton, in 1892. He'd been committed to the lunatic asylum a year to the day after he'd consulted an eminent London alienist, and 2 years to the day after one of his more barbarous murders was committed. And so we're linking him in Michael's mind anyway to Jack the Ripper. And
Yeah, and about this same time, Prince Eddie contracted influenza. And there was a pandemic at the time in early 1892. And, given the unsavory and unsanitary habits of the royal men at this point, I was not surprised that he contracted a communicable disease, and eventually it killed him. Eddie, that is Prince Edward, Duke of Clarence, died at Sandringham in the night of the 13th and 14th of January, 1892. Now, recall James Kenneth Stephen died in St. Andrew's Hospital, Northampton, on February 3rd, 1892. But here's the really interesting analysis that he said what happened makes it clear when we look at the death certificate. The cause of death of James Kenneth Stephen is given as mania, 2.5 months, persistent refusal of food, 20 days. The date of death is given as 3rd February, 1892. If one subtracts 20 days from the 3rd of February, one arrives at the 14th of January. James Stephen, having no more wish to live, began his fatal hunger strike on learning that the faithless Eddie was dead.
Yes, and Michael comes to the conclusion that the authorities simply let James Stephen go rather than work to maintain his life. And reminds us that if you visit Eton College Chapel and in the Chapel of King's College, Cambridge, there are brass plates to commemorate the man who, as sportsman and scholar, had earned the admiration of his contemporaries. And so, what a remarkable fall for James K. Stephen. But then, we wind up with the connection to Sherlock Holmes. So where is Holmes? Michael has said before, this was such a muddle of the authorities that Holmes was nowhere involved. But he says much more research than has up to the present been done is needed before we may really know exactly how Holmes' services were employed in that hushing up of maniac savagery that the prestige of the crown rendered essential. Somewhere, somehow, says Michael, Holmes was involved as Watson's typically Watsonian reference to Bert Stevens, the terrible murderer, makes clear.
And there we have a footnote that J.K. Stevens' elder brother was a Bert, too. Sir Herbert
Stevens. Oh, Herbert Stephen, how about that? So what do you think of that? Do you think Michael made a convincing case there that Bert Stevens is sort of a code word that suggests that Holmes and Watson knew that J.K. Stephen was Jack the Ripper and that Holmes was involved in protecting the crown?
Well, there's not enough evidence for me to conclude that he didn't do it.
Well, see, now that's the lovely part about Ripperology, because you have these things that are notorious, that are widely known, that are gruesome, and that are unexplained, and for some reason we continue to find that these sorts of things just fascinating.
We do, and I think it's a wonderful testament to the creativity and the perspicacity of Sherlock Holmes scholars, that they will dig around and go through records, as Michael did, of the insane asylum and death certificates and whatnot, and can piece together a rational story that makes sense when you look at all of the facts as presented. And as Michael has put it together, like I say, there's nothing that indicates that James Kenneth Stephen didn't do it, but I suppose you could fall easily on the other side as well.
And that is hardly a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.